Interested in playing chess the medieval way? This episode is for you. Welcome to the Medieval Grad Podcast. It's a podcast brought to you by medievalists.net, where we chat with graduate students and early career researchers to learn about the new trends and the future of research in medieval studies. I'm Lucie Laumonier, a medieval historian and the podcast's host. And today we're chatting with Alexandra Montero Peters, a PhD candidate in history at the University of Chicago. Hello, Alexandra. Thank you very much for being here.
Hello, Lucie. Thank you for having me.
So for a start, tell us what brought you to studying the Middle Ages and Iberian Mediterranean medieval history.
Oh gosh, so I've always had a fascination with the Middle Ages since I can remember. That usually manifested in reading anything I could find at the bookstore on King Arthur, the very typical UK medieval history sort of thing. Somehow in high school, I decided that I was only going to apply to universities that had medieval studies. My interests changed quite drastically once I went to the university, and I can credit that to two really important people. One of them being my mother. She is an Ecuadorian immigrant, so she was born and partially raised in Ecuador, and really wanted me to continue developing and using Spanish. So I thought, well, let's see what was going on in Spain in the Middle Ages without any idea, any clue how incredible and rich that world would be. And that interest was further supported by the first medieval historian I really spent time with, which was Professor Jonathan Lyon at the University of Chicago as an undergrad there. I found a lot of the themes that represent my culture, the mixing of different peoples, different races, ethnicities, really represented, but quite differently in this time period in Iberia and North Africa. So needless to say, I was hooked.
In your PhD, you study a stunning Iberian manuscript dated from the 13th century and known as the Book of Games. At the time, as you already mentioned, Iberia, which designates modern Spain and Portugal, was fragmented into Christian kingdoms and Islamic lands. It was really a multicultural melting pot, including a very large Jewish population. To give some kind of background to our audience, would you paint a broad and quick picture of the geopolitics of Iberia in the 13th century?
Yes, absolutely. So my manuscript, El Libro de los Juegos, or the Book of Games, was part of a huge translation enterprise promoted by and deeply important to the King of Castile, Leon, Alfonso X. He ruled from about 1252 to 1284. So that is one kingdom. And there's, of course, the crown of Aragon, there's Navarre, there's the quite young Portuguese kingdom. And to the south, in Iberia, you have Muslim polities, whether that's the Almohads, which at this time are on the outs, they're declining. You have the Nasrids, which are on the rise, and we know them from 1492 with the conquest of Granada. So this, besides this, I think it's really important to highlight that Muslims, Jews, and Christians, regardless of whether this was under Christian power or Muslim power in Iberia, all lived together. And I will put that in quotations because that doesn't mean literally together. There were often segregated parts of towns, but they were all within different kingdoms, and as such, royal powers needed to negotiate. How do we deal with these differences? Equally so, we would see that Christian monarchs would align with Muslims in order to fight their wars and in skirmishes against other Christian monarchs in Iberia. We would see Muslim rulers become vassals to Christian monarchs or fight, obviously, against Christian monarchs in order to try to conquer or reconquer certain areas. And amidst all of this, we had, like you said, a huge population, a Jewish population, that negotiated its own status, power, and security within all of these multiple power dynamics and different political regimes. So that's a quick and dirty summation of what's going on there. But yes, it's a fascinatingly complex political environment.
Let's go back to the Libro de los Juegos, the Book of Games. This manuscript is very peculiar. It was commissioned by the King Alfonso X, nicknamed the Wise, and it's deeply entrenched with Islamic tradition. So tell us, what was this manuscript? What is it about?
Sure. So first, the manuscript, the object itself. Firstly, I have had the utmost privilege of viewing this in person a number of times. It's at the Escorial, just outside of Madrid, and it is huge. We're talking. I should have pulled up the actual measurements, but this is a huge, heavy book, both hands to carry it. And in this manuscript, almost every folio is richly illuminated with a scene of individuals playing the games or creating the little pieces like dice or the chess figures to play them. And so the contents of this incredible royal manuscript are basically three, more or less, parts that deal with chess, table games. So table games are a mixture of strategy and dice. And then, of course, dice games. And they are all couched within this framework of they come from wise kings in India who wanted to figure out what was better, a man ruled by his intellect or by chance, by the roll of a die. And Alfonso provides his own, when I say Alfonso provides his own commentary, his scriptorium and his voice provide commentary on what they believe to be the par excellence for discussing kingly power, which is chess, because it's intellectual. It requires an acuity of mind that kings master. It was begun and created in 1283. I already mentioned that Alfonso oversaw this wonderful, we call it the scriptorium, in which manuscripts were produced either because they were translated directly from other sources or because they were a mixture or because they were totally new. This Libro de los Juegos represents a mixture. So what's really amazing about this is that scholars have already done a marvelous job proving that a lot of the chess problems come from Arabic manuscripts, both anonymous and some of them are attributed to authors from both contemporaneous time periods and before. And so the prologue has a particularly Alphonsine stamp. It's not a translation. And there are invented games that are wholly new and unique to the Alphonsine scriptorium. They were his contribution in what he gave to this particular aspect of court culture.
The manuscript really seems very fascinating. And before we move on with the manuscript, I have a quick follow-up question. Did medieval people actually play these games?
Oh, absolutely. This is probably why this metaphor, chess, being a metaphor of power, of intellectualism, all of that is so potent. Because while it is still somewhat new to the European context, it is nevertheless so popular that we know everybody from the laity to royals, from peasants to knights are playing these games. And when I say these games, I'm not just saying chess. There are dice games in this. There are table games like what we would call backgammon, or in the Arabic tradition, nard. And the reason I believe we find this manuscript at this moment is because these games also represent a peculiar tension between determinism, so your fate, the implacable fate, and your free will. But games have a ambiguous relationship with gambling, with maybe not respecting free will or not respecting chance, because depending on what your theological stance is on this, it matters. And so, yes, like I said, this manuscript is about games, but it's about almost the very underpinnings of how we approach man's power, our place in the world, and everything like that. And it was so potent because, yes, everybody was playing these games.
Yeah, it's a very philosophical take on the world of games. And as you mentioned, indeed, dice, they were quite popular. And just north of the Pyrenees, and I'm more a historian of medieval France, there are so many laws preventing people from playing dice because it was associated with taverns, prostitution. But it was kind of the poor people games.
And I think it's worth mentioning that chess traditionally had been played with dice. And so a lot of the questions about its permissibility had this question about, well, is this gambling? And we have Islamic treatises that just quarrel back and forth about, well, even if we don't play it with dice, and even if we play it in private, and we don't do it for the purpose of stakes, aka gambling, is this still licit? And even though Alfonso does not seem to feel that dice games, pure dice games, are something a king should pursue, and he does not associate himself with that part of the manuscript strongly like he does with chess. He does associate himself with table games, and table games, by definition, include dice. So it is a very complicated exploration of this issue that was far from being decided upon.
Again, another tangent. I need to ask this question: how do you play chess with dice?
Yeah, that's a great question. As you can probably tell, I am not a historian of games. I'm a historian of the ideas surrounding them, and so I believe, from what I have read from the scholarship, you would use it in a way to facilitate quickening the game, or deciding how you move the chess pieces, for example, how many places, etc. But by the time that Alfonso is illuminating people playing chess, we don't see dice, though he does mention that dice have been used and that they can quicken gameplay.
Let's go back to your dissertation. So you pay special attention to the textual tradition of the Book of Games across the southern and eastern rims of the Mediterranean. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so like I've said, scholars have already done some of the work for me by not only establishing the link between parts of this manuscript with ones in the Islamic tradition, but also we know from the other Alphonsine projects that include histories, poetry, astrological texts, that there were quite a lot of other Arabic manuscripts that the Alphonsine project had worked with across this period. And so I am trying to bridge all of this knowledge together in my dissertation. And so what I am doing is I am allowing this manuscript, the Libro de los Juegos, to show me the sorts of metaphors I can research that, in essence, spill forth the many still untold connections the Alphonsine intellectual tradition project had with the Islamic one. So, for example, in these illuminations, we find women who are, I argue, depictions of enslaved women trained in all manners of entertainment and scholarship, literally scholarship, called the Kian. Through researching them, I discovered that during both Alfonso and his father's time, there was a bustling economy of these women being trained in Seville, which was then Islamic, and then only recently conquered by Alfonso's father. And these women were featured both prominently in Islamic intellectual core culture, as well as Islamic representations of everything from philosophy, chess, etc. As you can imagine, by excavating this metaphor and by running with this idea that these women really are Kian, that they are meant to embody high intellectual consumption of leisure, core culture, scholarship, or intellectualism is probably a better way to put this, that I was surprised to see this connection, that Alfonso is creating this manuscript in Seville, which had a long history with the Kian being trained and sent to rulers of North Africa for astronomical sums of money. These women, it's obviously unfortunate to be talking about enslaved peoples, but these women represented a level of exclusivity that would have been attractive to any monarch trying to portray his acumen in cultural and intellectual pursuits. They also, by the way, I should add, feature very prominently in the discussions of whether chess is moral, because they were so part of this culture that included music, chess, etc. We also know that from Arabic historians that some of these Kian, whether they were captured, sold, or gifted, found their way into Christian courts, both a little bit before Alfonso's time period. There's ample opportunity there, right, to really explore representations of kingship. And as if that weren't enough, we also have the fact that Alfonso represents himself in an illumination alongside these women. It's one of the few times we see him representing himself in this manuscript, and it's powerful. It's garnered a lot of attention, but we should take notice that these women were meant to articulate something about his intellectual prowess and his kingly power. And there's even more texts that go into this Libro de los Juegos, everything from the tradition like the Kitab al-Hayawan to the Kitab al-Mamelek or al-Masalik, which respectively deal with marvelous animals and geography of the world. And they help augment how Alfonso discusses India, the origins of chess, the animals and their backstories of the pieces in certain games of chess. So it's a marvelous synecdoche in a sense of how an object connects us to this interconnecting web of this intellectual discussion Alfonso so rightly wanted to be a center of.
So as you mentioned, Alexandra, the manuscript is very richly illuminated, and there are many, many, many different characters featured on these pages. You talked about these women, kind of very elite courtesans. Could you talk about this kind of representations and who are the people represented on the pages, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so first of all, almost every folio is illuminated. So there's so many illuminations and depictions of daily life, or the imagination of what daily life would be like between disparate peoples. And we see representations of all three religions, so Muslims, Jews, and Christians, often in traditional garb. And we see nobility, royalty, falconers, apothecaries, monks, knights. We see Berbers of North Africa, which means depictions of different races. There is depictions of blackness. There's depictions of that both with men and women. And yes, what do we do with that? How do we understand this world that is such a rich and complex tapestry, and so accurate as well in some of the material culture that it relays to us? And all I can honestly comment on it and just say is that, turn back again to the whole definition of Alfonso's kingship, is that he wanted to place himself at the center of a much broader dialogue than whatever could take place in Iberia. It was one that encapsulated North Africa. It looked out to India, or what he believed was India, through the classical and Arabic tradition on India. And having this enormously complex representation of humanity allowed him to place himself in a dialogue that is so much wider than perhaps even the courtiers that would view this manuscript could imagine. And it's so integral to his notion of kingship being almost legendary in its mastery of the intellect and its promulgation of intellectual texts. So that's one way to look at it. But my gosh, there are many research questions what could do with the astounding number of illuminations.
You already mentioned Alfonso's ideas about kingship, so that's the perfect transition towards the next question, which is kind of why did Alfonso commission this manuscript?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways I could have approached this project. For example, I could approach how he related himself to other Christian monarchs, because he's pulling from them as well. Not to go down a tangent line, I'm going to go to my expertise, which is how he's pulling on his neighbors, whether it's the Almohads, whether it's the North African rulers, whatever that it may be, in order to inform his sense of kingship that, like we just discussed, is so much broader than Castile Leon, so much broader than Iberia. And his manuscript projects, all of them, work to represent that power, that intellectual kingship, in a tangible way. You could put your hand on it, and it's meant to be inheritable, something he passes on to the son. And it's meant to literally be a repository of all of this knowledge, which to him, he always wanted it to come across as Solomonic wisdom, something that could touch on everything and was almost biblical in its power and potency.
It's really interesting to see this king putting himself at the center of so many different traditions and kind of embracing it and creating a beautiful manuscript. All right. So I'd like to finish this discussion by a topic I've always been fascinated about, and it's the historiography about medieval Iberia. So it may be because my grandfather from my mother's side was actually Spanish, and he moved to France when he was a kid. So I don't know, maybe that's why. And I'm going to talk a little bit. So if I say something that's wrong, Alexandra, please correct me. In the 19th and well until the 20th century, many historians who looked at Spanish medieval history focused on the Reconquista, which is the Christian conquest of Iberia from Muslim hands. And this historiography had been highly politicized, especially in nationalist discourses, such as during Franco's dictatorship, to describe a Spanish past where Muslims were the invaders and the outsiders. So, for this historiography and these nationalist discourses, the real medieval history of Spain laid into the Christian kingdoms and before that in the kingdom of the Visigoths. And there was a shift in the 90s, maybe, with a new focus on the so-called convivencia, which means living together. And this historiography emphasized the harmony between Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and went insofar as to compare medieval Iberia to an earthly paradise.
It's so funny. This is near and dear to my heart because one of the first books, the first book I read on medieval Spain when my mother and advisors pointed me down this path was The Ornament of the World by Maria Rosa Menocal. And the funny thing about that is that it really created for me, like you said, this paradise notion where the three religions got along. They achieved grand feats of culture, art, intellect, all of that. Then I should also add, in the 90s, of course, my advisor's work, Communities of Violence by David Nierenberg, was published, which I would argue represented a clear shift in our treatment of all the themes you just mentioned and was also a harsh criticism of convivencia. And I have grown to appreciate that it was a far more complex thing, and that, first of all, convivencia is a modern term. Just like the Reconquista, we don't really use that term anymore because it politically and historically just doesn't fit in what we now appreciate to be the nuance and complexity of this period, in which there was equal opportunity and potential for extreme violence and extreme not coming together, as there was for keen discussions of sameness and difference that brought together these disparate people at times for incredible intellectual advancement. And so I fully empathize with it. It's amazing how this history has been reimagined, remanipulated, as history is wont to do across different time periods and different geopolitical scenarios. And now that I think, hopefully, we're moving past wondering about convivencia and whether or not reconquista is a valid term, I think an exciting place research is going now is the study of race in the medieval world. It is something I personally hope to contribute to as well, since I can see a lot of potential to further illuminate what we know about race in the Middle Ages through the materials Alfonso X produced or interacted with. I mean, just one quick example, he translates a discussion of Blackness from Al-Masudi, the Medals of Gold, in one of his sources. And no one, to my knowledge, has fully treated how problematic and also how important that one moment in this textual tradition was. And like I said, there's illuminations of individuals from Africa, and there's so much. And now that we, I think, with the likes of Geraldine Heng and others, are really unpacking the applicability and the usefulness of race as a term in the Middle Ages, we're really, I think, moving past the questions that so characterized the 1900s and even the early 2000s, and moving onward to questions that can even further illuminate how the medieval world dynamics can inform our own sense of present and future.
Well, thank you very much. And so for our listeners, we have an episode called Race in the Middle Ages and the Image of the Saracens. It's an interview with Tirumula Drew Narayanan. So I think it's episode 3, so you can go listen to it. Alexandra, my last question is a question I ask to all my guests, and it's, what advice would you give to a prospective grad student?
Oh, gosh. I actually really love this question. So I would first really recommend a couple practical things. So the practical things are, throw yourself at languages. Don't be afraid. First, if you don't end up using them for your studies, you will be infinitely the richer for having them. And so that, for me, pursuing Spanish more, throwing myself at Arabic, I started Latin in undergrad a little late. I was a senior, but I did all of that with an eye on helping myself in graduate school. The second thing I would say is lean on your faculty to guide you. Find great mentors. Don't be afraid to ask for their time, for their advice. And don't be turned away if some of them are skeptical of your desire to go to grad school, because it's a fraught territory. It's one where the future is contested every day, it feels, and in the news. But that leans into my next piece of advice, which is, if you're realistic about the job prospects, then please do graduate school for yourself, for your own edification and sense of growth.
Thank you very much, Alexandra.
Thank you for having me.
That was Alexandra Montero Peters, a PhD candidate at the University of Chicago. You can find out more about Alexandra in the show notes. Stay with us because the episode isn't over yet. Let's bring in Peter Konieczny from medievalist.net. Hi, Peter, how are you? What did you think of the interview?
Well, first of all, I think Alejandro could have not picked a better topic than working on medieval Spain, medieval Iberia. It's such a fascinating place, and I kind of remember I was introduced to it as an undergrad by Mark Meyerson, and that's like 25 years ago. So, and I was just so blown away about what a complex and interesting society it is. So, yeah, I think if you're looking for a field to go into, Iberia is got so much potential.
Yes, and I was so happy when I found Alexandra's page on the university's website because I love this manuscript, the Book of Games. I always share pictures on my Instagram account. It's such a beautiful manuscript, and it also resonates a little bit with me because I did my MA thesis on a French manuscript that was sort of a social political commentary about a game of chess.
Oh,
So
okay.
chess are indeed everywhere, and it's always not about chess, it's always about something else.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Games, it's so really cool to look at how it's so cross-cultural, how many kind of it weaves in this and that, like that. It's more than just the actual playing of the game. It takes in so much, and like it sounds like her research is like there's all these facets outside of the actual game that you have to consider. So it was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, she didn't really talk about the way they played chess back then, but I was so intrigued about that. Yes, let's use dice to play
Dice.
chess.
Yeah, dice. I bring that back.
I would like to, I don't know, maybe try to play game the medieval way.
Indeed,
But
indeed.
such a beautiful manuscript, and the intersection of different cultures, all the beautiful illuminations, such a rich source for medieval studies and medievalists. And she was so fortunate to actually go there and see the manuscript in person.
Yeah, yeah. I think I gotta check out this manuscript just because it sounds like it's just a beautiful set of imagery and things like that. So we'll try and like link it in the show notes where people can kind of see it for themselves.
I think it's actually, I don't think it has been digitized, and I think it just exists as facsimiles, and I would say rather poor
Mm.
reproductions on the internet. Every time I'm trying to share pictures of the manuscript, I just end up struggling to find something that looks good. So I don't think actually it's been digitized, which is a shame.
Okay, well, we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in an episode just coming up about digitized manuscripts.
Yes, indeed, indeed. So do you have resources you would like to share?
Yeah, like well, I want to actually share. Like she mentions a book by David Nuremberg, and I wanted to tell a bit more about it. It's called Communities of Violence, and it's from 1990s, and it's one of those books that's really really influential. And I think if you do medieval studies, that's some book you'll really want to read. And it kind of looks at, it's not just Spain, but also looks at southern France and looks at like attacks on minorities, whether they like be lepers or Jews or Muslims. And I really have a lot of respect for David Nuremberg. He's a really great scholar, and I think that's like a first-rate work. So I would suggest if you're interested in this, first thing is to go check out his book. But yeah, there's also lots of kind of other treatises on text and on chess as well. That it's a thing that medieval people talked a lot about.
All right. Thank you very much, Peter.
All right, thanks.
You are listening to the Medieval Grad podcast brought to you by medievalist.net. If you want to support us and this podcast, you can subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/medievalists. You can get a lot of neat benefits on Patreon, including being able to hear these episodes early. We love doing this show and we really appreciate your help. I'm Lucie Laumonier. You can find me on Instagram at The French Medievalist, and you can look me up on academia.edu. Thank you for tuning in. Au revoir.